Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I will be providing my full, complete ranking of the Star Wars adult canon novels. My most watched, viewed video on this channel is my ranking of the top 10 Star Wars adult canon novels, and I have gotten requests to do a full ranking of all the canon novels for the adult line, and I've also gotten requests for an updated list of my top 10 to see if anything's shifted or not. And so I thought I'd take this opportunity to do that here. So on my list, as of right now, as I'm recording this, there are 40 books out in consideration. There are a few books that don't count in my that I won't be including, and so those books are the two from a certain point of views, which are short story collections, and also the third book, which is the Cantobite stories. Those are novellas and short story collections, and they just didn't feel right including them with the novels. So this will include the novels, the novelizations, and the audio dramas. And by my current count, I have 40 of them. And so I'll rank my top 40. And so this is going to be a lot to get to in this video, so I won't go into depth on each individual book. I will basically say how I feel about it now, some interesting things about it from my perspective. Some of this stuff I've actually reviewed on the channel, and some of them I haven't, so some of this you'll probably be learning about my opinions on these books for the first time. So let me explain where everything falls for me. I have 5 different categories. I have a bad category, where I have 5 books. I have the okay category, where I have 7 books. I have the good category, where I have 9 books. I have the very good category, which is 9 books. And then I have the amazing top tier category, which is 10 books. So overall, I really enjoy the canon books. There's just a few that I don't like, but overall, I love the canon novels. So since there's so many to get to, why don't I jump right into it? So my number 40 is Dr. Aphra. This, I thought, was the very unnecessary book. I really like the comics, the Darth Vader comics that Aphra shows up in, but I feel like this didn't add enough to make me interested, and she's not a strong enough character for me to get too much into. I know the comics people love her. I know that she has her own mainline comics that I might eventually get to one day, but this book, it just literally did nothing, and I was very frustrated reading it, and it was so short. I read it in like an hour and a half, just about. There's so little meat to it. It should have had more, and so this is why this audio drama in written format is my number 40. Getting into my number 39, I have the third book in the Alphabet Squadron trilogy, Victory's Price. This book was so melancholy. As the trilogy went down, I became more and more melancholy when I was reading it, and I just couldn't stand it. And I know some people, a few booktubers, in fact, who loved this series, and they loved all of the fighter stuff. They loved all the political stuff that was in here. It just didn't work for me, and I did not like how sad I felt at the end of reading the books. I want my Star Wars books to be more happy towards the end, and unfortunately this did not do that, and it's my number 39. Then we have my number 38, which is Shadowfall, the second book in the Alphabet Squadron trilogy. I like this a little bit more than Victory's Price because I felt like it was paced better, but I still really struggled with this one as well. There was a lot that I didn't like in it, and for mostly the same reasons. The best book in that trilogy is my number 37, and that is Alphabet Squadron. What this book had was, I had an excitement behind it. It had the tie-in to the TIE Fighter comic, which I didn't love, but it had potential, and it also had a lot of Hera that I liked, and Hera's in the other books, but I didn't like her usage in the other books. I thought Hera was used pretty good here, and this book actually has some decent setup that just isn't paid off down the line well enough for me. And so this was an interesting book, but I was not happy with it after the trilogy was done, and so it knocked down into the not good category, unfortunately. The last of the bad books, in my opinion, is a novelization, and unfortunately, it is the Force Awakens novelization. I read this soon after the film came out, and I was very disappointed, one, at how short Dallin Dean Foster had made it, and two, how little he added. From what I can remember, there's just not that much added in this, and to me, a good novelization really not only adds a lot of material, but it makes me like the movie even more. this had no effect on the movie for me. I didn't love it more. I didn't hate it more necessarily. It had no effect. It's so forgettable. It does so little to really add context for the movie. And so that's why this is my number 36. But now we have gone through all of the bad books, so we're now getting into the okay books, the books that I thought were actually pretty decent, pretty okay. I didn't love them, I didn't hate them, I just thought they were okay. So let's get into my number 35, which is Heir to the Jedi. This, for a while, was my least favorite Star Wars book, but it actually grew a tiny bit on me, and that's why it jumped up into the okay category, because I didn't love what they did with Luke in this book. I feel like Kevin Hearn didn't get the character of Luke right. I also think that it was probably not the smartest idea to make this book a first-person novel, and I think it should have been a third-person novel. I also think that this was misguided, that it was put in the canon, but it was meant to be Legends. I think that it feels awkward. When you're reading it, it does not feel in place for me. And so that's why this is my number 35, but it's still actually an okay novel. It's entertaining. Going into my number 34 is another novelization, and that is The Rise of Skywalker by Ray Carson. This one added a little bit to the movie and actually recontextualized a few scenes for me, particularly around Leia and Leia's death, and also about Rey's training and about some of the stuff regarding the Resistance and their headquarters. Other than that, did not really add enough to be desired for me, and so that's why it's in the okay category. That's my number 34. My number 33 is actually a very controversial novel. I've seen people put it really high and really low, and that is Last Shot by Daniel Jose Older. This one actually kind of soured for me over time. I enjoyed the way he wrote Han and the way that he wrote Han's fatherhood. That was great. I did not love the way he wrote Lando, and I did not like the way he wrote the villains. The villains were just too out there for me. You can go out there on a few things in Star Wars. The villains here are too out there for me, and I don't like it when they lean into Lando's other qualities that I don't like. And so that's why this book is only in the okay category, but the Han stuff is enough to save it. The Han stuff, I think, is really good. And it was a good tie-in for Solo, I thought, because it had some good hints. That's number 33. Number 32 is a book, Battlefront Twilight Company, another Alexander Freed original novel. His novels are ranked pretty low for me in the adult series, sadly. He has one book that if you use process of elimination, you'll know which one it is, that is actually much higher in the list. So he can write good Star Wars for me, but his original novels, not so much. But I liked Battlefront Twilight Company for the tiny references that it had to the actual Battlefront game, and I also liked that this book recontextualized a lot of things surrounding the Battle of Hoth, and it has a reference to Count Vidian, which I loved. Other than that, the characters are pretty forgettable, which is why it makes it into the meh category. Then we have the lowest I've ever rated a book by Timothy Zahn, and that is Thrawn Alliances. I thought that this was a very mediocre book. I thought that parts of it worked really well and parts of it didn't. What was bad about this book was the disjointedness for me. Thrawn and Vader flashing back to Thrawn and Anakin was a good idea, and both are stories that I would have wanted, but going back and forth made it A, confusing, and B, just not as interesting as it could have been. And it also had Galaxy's Edge, which should be great that you have these tie-ins to Galaxy's Edge, and it just didn't really go where I wanted it to go in there. Zahn, of course, always gets the character of Thrawn. I thought he did okay with Vader. I thought he did okay with Anakin and Padme. It leaves a lot to be desired for me, and it is the weakest Timothy Zahn entry in the canon. And then we get into my number 30, which is The Fallen Star. I really enjoyed the first two High Republic novels, and I'll talk about those later. This one I thought was okay, and I thought that it had the epicness that it needed for the finale, but unfortunately too much was telegraphed, not only in the marketing, but in the jacket, in the direct promotion of the novel. There's too much revealed about this book, and so it takes away, for me, a lot of the fun in the book. That being said, it feels perfectly in place with the rest of the High Republic novels, and if you're enjoying the Republic as a whole, you won't feel disappointed in this book. You'll just or too much, I should say. You won't feel this is a bad book. You'll just feel, it could have been more, but it got the minimum required necessary to make it an okay book. And then we have my number 29, which is the last of my okay category, and that is Tarkin. Again, a book that actually was lower on my list and actually grew over time, especially with my reread of it. What makes this book so great upon reread is what it does with the Empire. It really recontextualizes a lot for me for the Empire, and it really makes me understand Tarkin, Vader, and the Emperor. And also, it just has some cool set pieces and some cool action later in the book, but it's such a slog to get to that cool action that a lot of people tuned out in this book. But it is, for me, highly worth it because I think it's really, really entertaining. But the beginning is so hard to get into. It's the only, if you take out like the first chapter and a half, this book climbs the list so much. But that first chapter and a half just drags it down an incredible amount. So now we're getting into my good category. I thought these were good novels. I thought these were pretty. I enjoyed the process of reading them almost through and through. And getting into my number 28 is Shadow of the Sith. This is a recent release by Adam Christopher. What I liked about this book was it really did a lot of legwork to make the sequel trilogy work better. I really enjoyed the writing of Luke in this book. It's the best we've gotten of Luke in the canon, I think. I also liked how Aaron Christopher was not only able to make Luke a good character and Lando a good character, but he was also able to weave in all of these elements from the sequel trilogy. Ochi of Bestoon, Rey and Rey's parents. He was able to throw in the First Order and the Final Order. He was able to throw in the Acolytes of the Beyond from Chuck Wendig's novels. And so he weaved them all in together. And it's a fun novel. It's really well done. It's really big and epic in scope while being not too many characters, so it's kind of easy to follow. So I think it's a really good book. Next, we're going into my number 27. Speaking of the Acolytes of the Beyond and Chuck Wendig, I have a Chuck Wendig book for me, which is Aftermath Life Debt. I enjoyed the Aftermath trilogy a lot more than a lot of people did. And of the trilogy, I think this one's the weakest. This is the book that has the Manchurian Candidate plotline, which I really enjoyed. I also really enjoyed a lot of the third act and the whole set pieces. I liked that we had the new villain in this book that I won't give away. The problem is I don't like where they took him in the next book, which is kind of brings this one a little bit down. And the opening set piece, I really liked it the first time I read it, and after then I was like, it's not as great as I remembered. But it's very much a Chuck Wendig book. Next, we're getting into my number 26. Wow, we're already at 26. And this would be The Last Jedi novelization. There's, of course, a lot of opinions. Some people hate The Last Jedi, some people love it. But what I think a lot of people who've actually read the book have said is it actually adds a lot of context. This book has a lot of information that is not in the movie. There's a lot of new scenes, there's a lot of new characters, things that just really recontextualize everything and make it work much better. A lot of people who complain about the Holdo maneuver and stuff, that's actually explained well in here. And so there's things like that where this book was able to go where the movie couldn't go. And that's why it ranks higher than some of the other novelizations that I've talked about in the canons. That's why this is my number 26. Now we're getting into my number 25 is another Aftermath novel, and that is Aftermath Empire's End. The action in this book is superb. The third act in this book is superb. I mentioned I didn't like where one of the villains went in this book, but the action is so good in this book, and the payoffs for the heroes is actually quite good. And I think that this adds a lot of context to the sequel trilogy that they really didn't know because the sequel trilogy wasn't planned out. Chuck Wendig got super lucky in the way that he wrote this book, and the trilogy as a whole, but this book in particular. So I thought it was highly enjoyable, and this was one of those that I picked up on release day, and I was like, ooh, this is so good. So now we're getting into my number 24. Wow. Number 24 is Battlefront Inferno Squad by Christie Golden. Christie Golden, one of the best media tie-in fiction authors in the business. She's forgotten more about media tie and fiction than I'll probably ever know. She wrote this book, which is like a prequel to the game, and it is a superb prequel. It feels like you're reading stuff about the game, but it's an original story. It adds so much to the game, it adds so much to the characters. I was invested in the characters when the game came out because I read this before. I was super invested in the story. And I think that this book also adds a lot to Rogue One, and it adds a lot to other things. So I was super happy with this book. And so that's why this is my number 24. Let's get into my number 23, which is going to be, for me, the best of the Aftermath novels, and that is Aftermath. So many people have put this as the lowest Aftermath novel, and I totally understand why. If you read this wanting to have answers to episode 7 to explain the time frame between episode 6 and 7, you're going to be disappointed. If you had a specific type of plot that you were looking for with big, expansive characters, with huge set pieces, with all this stuff, you're going to be disappointed. But if you just want a fun adventure, Star Wars Rebels Season 1 style, where you put together a motley crew that would never ordinarily come together and they have to deal with something, and it feels very much like a television, like episodes of a television show, then this is the book for you. It really worked for me. I think that the writing style in this book is a plus because it feels so different that it's jarring, that it keeps you engaged. And for me, I loved it cover to cover. It's my favorite of the Aftermath novels because it did exactly what I wanted it to do. The other ones tried to split the difference between being a Chuck Wendig novel and being where it's like this, and also trying to be the big epic Star Wars novel, because I think he learned, hey, people didn't like some of the things he did in here, and also what he was allowed to do at the time, it wasn't allowed to do at the time. But this one did what I would have wanted it to do, which is to tell a fun, small story, because the more small stories you can do, the more novels you can get. If you do just huge, big novels, it's really hard to fill in the rest of the timeline. So that's why I really enjoyed this one, and it's my number 23. My number 22 is another novelization, and that is the Solo: A Star Wars Story novelization by Mur Lafferty. I think that this novelization adds a lot to Solo. Solo's one of my favorite films in Star Wars. I love the music in it. I love the action. I love just about everything about it. And this book adds a lot. It doesn't necessarily have as much new material as, say, The Last Jedi novelization, but what little bit extra it does have really enhances it. Certain characters like Enfys Nest have a lot of work done. Kira has a lot of work done. Han has a lot of work done, and that's why this book works so well for me, and that's why it's number 23. Sorry, 22. My number 21 is Resistance Reborn by Rebecca Roanhorse. This book dipped for me because it really doesn't have an actual plot. It's more of a bunch of random things that kind of work together towards the end. And so because of its lack of cohesiveness, it doesn't work as well. And it's not as high in my upper echelons. But what works for this novel is the feeling of interconnectedness that this book gave the canon. Up until this point, so many canon novels felt like maybe a character would show up in one book and maybe show up in another. Or you felt like a little bit of a reference would show up here or there. But it didn't feel interconnected like the EU did. It did not feel like we had this story that had great impact on this story, which had great impact on this story. We didn't have that feeling in the canon. This book finally put it there. If you've read the Claudia Gray novels in the canon, this book added a lot and had those characters. If you read the Chuck Wendig books, this book had stuff for you. If you've read some of the YA stuff, this book had stuff for you. If you've read the Battlefront books, this book had stuff for you. So it just felt like it was someone finally saying, yes, I've read all the books, and here's all my connections that I can make to them. So that's why this is my number 21. The last of my good category is going to be the book Dooku Jedi Lost by Cavan Scott. This is an audio drama. What makes this book work for me is it really adds a lot to Dooku, and it's just an entertaining book. The problem is it there are parts of it that should have been longer and parts of it that should have been shorter, but it's still, as a whole, entertaining. It looks huge. When you read it, you look at it, you're like, oh my goodness, it's so big. It's actually a really quick read because it's just an audio drama, so it's just a script. But where the last audio drama I talked about, I felt added nothing of value, this one has everything to value. One, because it's an original story, and two, because it's exploring a character, Dooku, that we haven't gotten much of. We're supposed to get the Tales of the Jedi TV show really, really soon, and I'm curious to see if there's any references to this book in that, or if they'll go diverging. I'll be interested in how that works. But this is still highly entertaining audio drama. Now we're getting into my very good category. These are the books that I was like giving like an 8.5 to a 9.2 out of 10. Like, man, these are good books, and I really enjoyed them, really want to reread them a lot. I love these books. So let's get into my number 19, which is Phasma. Really enjoyed this book, really enjoy Delilah Dawson's writing style. She is quickly becoming one of my favorite media tie-in authors, and just a really great author in general. I have read her non-Star Wars stuff and enjoyed it, but what makes this book feel so good is that it's so different. It, again, like the first Aftermath book, it's so viscerally different than anything you've ever read in Star Wars, yet intrinsically still has the feeling of Star Wars in it, that it just propelled me through, and I read it so fast, and I loved it, and I want to reread it soon. And it has the kind of Mad Max Fury Road type epicness. It also has some great tie-ins to the sequel trilogy, and what makes it so interesting is that there was a scene cut from The Last Jedi that, had it been in there, this book would have been like, whoa, they did this and that did that, and oh my goodness, they connect. And unfortunately, they cut the scene, and so this book becomes moot almost, if you're thinking about it that way. But as an original story, it's still so entertaining. Even if you didn't like Phasma in the movies, you'll probably enjoy her in this book, because, man, Delilah Dawson does such a good job here. So, getting into my number 18 is going to be the novel Greater Good from the Thrawn Ascendancy series. Oh, this Thrawn Ascendancy series, as a trilogy, is the best Star Wars trilogy in the canon. What it does so well is it feels cohesive. It feels like Zahn had a plan beginning to end. It feels connected. It feels consistently great. Like, they all were very close in level of good production quality. And it was, it gave us a sense of something new. It felt like a traditional science fiction novel in the Star Wars universe. If you'd taken out Thrawn, Aralani, and the handful of Star Wars terms as we know it, this could have just been one of Zahn's original science fiction novels that he does with Tor Publishing or Bain Publishing. It really felt original, and that's why I liked it so much. So that is Greater Good, number 18, but of the Ascendancy trilogy, it's probably the weakest, but it's still good. Whew. Number 17 is Tempest Runner. Tempest Runner, really excellent book, and best of the audio dramas we've gotten. Adds a lot to the character of Lorna D, who has the ship named the Lorna D, and it really adds to the High Republic, and it's also just super entertaining. So that's my number 17. Now we are getting into my number 16 in my ranking, and that is Lords of the Sith by Paul S. Kemp. This tells, if you really invested in the planet of Ryloth like I am, then you'll love this book. Ryloth is one of my favorite planets, and this Twi'lek is one of my favorite species in Star Wars, so to get a full novel really with them is really fun. Plus you get a lot of great dark side stuff with Vader and the Emperor. Lots of fun. The problem is the plot's not anything spectacular to write home about for me, so that's why it's not better. If the plot had been just a little bit better executed, a little bit grander in scope, a little bit higher stakes, because the stakes didn't feel high, if you had just been a little bit better, it would have climbed the list significantly. But still, really, really entertaining. My number 16. Now we're getting into my number 15, a book that does not get enough attention and is one of the most underrated books in Star Wars, and that is Black Spire by Delilah Dawson. I've talked about how much I love her unique writing style. It is unique here. I also really like the character of Vi Maradi. I also really like the character of Cardinal in this book. I also really like the characters Around them, I like the way it ties into Galaxy's Edge. Star Wars is a media tie-in fiction property, so when the books tie into things, I really like them, and this book's all about the tie-ins to the park, so it really works for me. And the plot. I complain about plot as being a thing that drags down a lot of the canon novels for me. While the character work is usually really high, the plot drags me down. The plot in here is what makes it so good. Same with Phasma that Dawson also wrote. Her plots are just so good, and I really enjoy the types of stories she wants to tell in Star Wars. So that's my number 15. Now we're getting into number 14, which is Thrawn Ascendancy Lesser Evil, the longest novel in the canon, and the second longest Star Wars novel ever written, behind another Timothy Zahn novel, Vision of the Future, which was also finishing up another Timothy Zahn epic property with Thrawn. Anyway, this book, for one, is massive, and it completes the Ascendancy trilogy. It really wraps up all the plot lines. It does every single thing it needs to do. It is consistently good, like the other Thrawn Ascendancy novels, and it's just so entertaining, and it's got the science fiction battles that you need, and it ties into some Legends stuff. Yeah, it ties in some Legends stuff. It ties into some canon stuff. It ties into Rebels, the TV show. It ties into Clone Wars. Oh, this has all the tie-ins, so it's really, really good. An excellent conclusion to the Thrawn Ascendancy trilogy. Next, we have my number 13, which is Dark Disciple by Christie Golden. A really short book, but man, does it pack a wallop. If you like the Clone Wars series, you have to read this book, because this book is literally Clone Wars episodes that was adapted into a novelization. And Christie Golden knows exactly what to add in, what to take out, what to make an excellent novel. She's one of the most advanced and most well-equipped media tie-in novelists in history. She's done so many, and so many of them have been bestsellers, and there's a reason that Blizzard hired her to write material for them, because she's that good of a writer. And this book was just superb. I know Katie Lucas, the daughter of George Lucas, actually was responsible for a lot of the scripts in here, as was Dave Filoni. And Katie Lucas writes the foreword to this book, which is really funny in and of itself. But this book, delightful, really good if you're a Clone Wars fan. That's why it's my number 13. My number 12 is another recent release, and that is The Princess and the Scoundrel. Delightful, delightful novel. If you want to know about Han and Leia's relationship, this is a book for you. It's right after Endor. It actually establishes a lot of political stuff. It ties into the other novels and comics. It has a lot of comics ties in, and it really sets the stage for their relationship and for the state of the galaxy. It ties into the Halcyon Cruiser. It ties into some of the other books. There is one reference in here that made me literally jump out of my seat because I was so excited when I read it. Beth Revis really hit the sweet spot with this book, and it's just really well done. Didn't entirely love the third act, but still really, really well done. My number 11, the last of my very, very good books, like these are so good, is going to be Thrawn Treason. This is the third book in the Thrawn trilogy in the canon, and this book tells such an entertaining military science fiction mystery story. Thrawn is trying to figure out who is causing all the problems, and he only has a week to do it. Because this book has such parameters, there's only a week that Timothy Zahn could work with to tell this story. He actually makes the most out of it. And Eli Vanto returns, and Arlani returns, and it feels like the natural successor to the original Thrawn novel. This is the Thrawn novel we should have gotten instead of Alliances. Alliances felt filler. This book felt like it's what we should have gotten. And it's so well paced. It's perfect Thrawn. The conclusion is so good. Third act, so superb here. For me, only thing that keeps it from greatness is the middle act. The middle part feels a little bit weird, but still really, really good book. Now we're getting to my top 10. So these are interesting. Not only are these my top 10 Star Wars novels as of right now, in canon, I should say, but also they're my most amazing, like, getting between a 9.2 and like a 10 out of 10. Like, really superb Star Wars novels. Can't gush about these. I basically have nothing bad to say about these books. So good. And I really enjoy them. So my number 10 is going to be a novelization, and that is going to be Rogue One, a Star Wars story. First of all, brilliant novelization, does this. If I have to point anyone to any novelization, this is one of them that I would point to. There's also two Star Trek novelizations I would point to, but this is one of the Star Wars, the only Star Wars one I would truly point to as the most excellent example of media tie-in fiction and a novelization. It adds so much, yet it does it in such a small amount of pages. It does so many unique things. The memos in this book were brilliant. The thoughts into Mon Mothma and her reactions, the way it ties into Catalyst, the way it ties into all these Star Wars Rogue One era things, and just the way that it just retells the story, which was just an amazing story anyway, just works so well for it, and that's why it's my number 10. My number 9 is Thrawn Ascendancy, Chaos Rising, the first in the Thrawn Ascendancy books. This is the best of the Ascendancy books for me. Boy, does it set up some awesome things. Boy, does it have a weird feeling at the beginning that I just loved. This book threw so many people for a loop because we had gotten 3 Thrawn novels in a row, boom, 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 and we were like, do we really need more? And the answer was yes, absolutely, we need more. And these books were so different that it just caught the fandom's imagination, and it was just so delightful. So this is my number 9. And the military stuff, it's got some Star Trek vibes, it's got some military science fiction, it's got Star Wars vibes, it's got Clone Wars vibes. There's so much about this book that's just so good. So that's my number 9. My number 8 is another new release from this year, the best of this year's books in my opinions, Brotherhood, quintessentially Attack of the Clones novel. It's the most quintessential Attack of the Clones era book, in my opinion. It really gets everything right from that era. I did not like a lot of the Attack of the Clones-ish era books, like the books released from like 2002 to 2005 that have to do with either the Attack of the Clones or the concept of the Clone Wars itself, really didn't work for me. None of those novels did in that time frame. This book tells one of those types of stories and does it really, really, really well for me. And I thought this was the best we've gotten of the Anakin Obi-Wan dynamic in the canon. In the books for canon, obviously, Clone Wars itself did amazing. This book bridges the divides of the Attack of the Clones version and the Clone Wars version of the characters. It also explains some story beats from Revenge of the Sith that are interesting. And just as a story, it's a really good story. So that's why it's my number 8. My number 7 is a Claudia Gray book, and this is a book where it's hard to explain why I love it so much, and it's Bloodline. For one, it gets Leia right, really right, which Claudia Gray always does. For number 2, it tells a really interesting political story, if you like political stories. Number 3, it adds a lot of context to the prequel era, or to the sequel era. And number 4, it adds a lot of context to the Han and Leia relationship. It's like a bookend to Princess and the Scoundrel this is towards the end of their relationship. That book's towards the beginning. This book also just tells some really funny references and connections to the Star Wars universe. And it has a really big whoa moment a couple of times, which I really liked. So that's why this is my number 7. My number 6 is going to be Catalyst, a Rogue One story. I talked about how the Rogue One novelization is a perfect example of a novelization. This book is not only a perfect example of a media tie-in fiction novel, it is a perfect example of a prequel book. What this book does, it got people energized for the movie. It told the backstory of certain characters who don't get that much screen time. Krennic and Galen Erso do not have a huge amount of backstory, and neither does Lila in the movie. You have like a little few sentences where they talk about their backstory, and that's about it. This is an entire novel of backstory for them, and it released right before the movie. I read it on release day, and I got pumped up for the movie. I was excited for the movie, as most people were, but it wasn't my number 1 most anticipated movie. But this book got me excited because I was like, ooh, there are all these things I know. It's an entertaining story. It's a big, it covers a lot of timeline. It really gets into some Clone Wars stuff, into some building of the Death Star. It gets into the bureaucracy and politics without getting into the bureaucracy and the politics. That's a really hard concept to explain, but yeah. So that's why this is my number 6. My number 5 is from my favorite media tie-in fiction author, and that is A New Dawn by John Jackson Miller. If you like Rebels and you like Kanan or Hera, you're gonna love this book. It's just a fun book. It really adds context to their relationship and to what happened with them. We need a sequel to this book where they meet Zeb and Sabine. This has some of the best original characters in the canon. Count Vidian, amazing villain. Ray Sloane, amazing Imperial character. You have some characters that I don't want to spoil that are in this book, but have smaller roles but still really memorable that I loved in this book. I'll just say there's a Celestin that's really good in this book, and a human that is also really good in this book. So, and this tells a spy story, it tells an espionage-type thriller. It also has the Jedi in hiding that John Jackson Miller is so good at, so it's a really, really good book. Now we're getting into my number 4, and my number 4 is another High Republic novel, and that is The Rising Storm by Cavan Scott. This book and the first book, which I always went back and forth for a while on what I thought of them. What makes this book so good is the plot. Cavan Scott's kind of like Delilah Dawson. He's just so good at his plots. And this book is the epic, huge scale and connections that the Star Wars canon novels needed. And it also has a moment at the end that started a literal hashtag, Cav knows what he did, which was really funny. And it's got the feels, and it's also got the epic lore stuff. It's got the epic scope and story stuff. It's just so much fun. So I love this book. My number 3 is the best Timothy Zahn novel on the list, and that is Thrawn. Thrawn, such a good book. Is like the quintessential Star Wars mystery book, where Thrawn is Sherlock and Eli Vanto is Watson. Love it. Everything about this book was done to perfection. It's just so good, and it ties into Rebels well. It has also a great political story and theme. It has some really sad moments, some really happy moments, and it really makes you go, grr, you want to throw things at the wall, not because you hate the book, but because you're so mad at characters in the book who are hurting your heroes. Oh, it's so good. So that's why this is my number 3. My number 2 is Light of the Jedi by Charles Soule, the best High Republic novel, and really a great kickoff to the series. Gave it a lot of oomph. I was so pumped. I read it like 3 times. I just loved this book and all the opportunities that this book gave. I can't wait to read it again, and I can't wait to see what this is building to. So perfect. The way that Charles Soule writes the Force is great. The way he does plotting is great. The way he did the hyperspace disaster with all the different viewpoints is great. The way that he sets everything up is great. It just, everything worked for me on this book. And so well that I went out and bought another Charles Soule novel, which I'm reading right now. He needs to write more novels. He's done so much comics. He needs more novels. His novels are good. So that's my number 2. And my number one canon novel is, if you've been following along, you might be able to figure it out by process of elimination, but it is Master and Apprentice by Claudia Gray. As a single novel, so good. There are like books as a series. For instance, I would put the Ascendancy trilogy higher than this book for me as a trilogy. But I think that this as a standalone novel is the best standalone novel we've gotten in the canon. Perfect Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan relationships. Absolutely perfect Qui-Gon Obi-Wan relationships. Amazing prequel energy and prequel stuff happening in this book. Great prequel references, great prequel characters, great pre-episode 1 stuff. The Jedi Council is great. The plot is great. The way that there are certain Jedi described in this book, you're like, that makes me rethink the Jedi Order in some ways, good and bad. And it's just an excellent examination at the master and apprentice relationship. At first, I don't like it when they just title things general, like Thrawn or Tarkin or Master and Apprentice. I want it to be like a Master and Apprentice, the Race for Crash Point Tower. Like, I want novels to have a very specific title that relates to them, because if you just do general novel titles, you run out of those type of general titles. But if you do specific, it works better. So I don't love the title, but that's like the only thing I don't like about this book. This book has one of the best Star Wars quotes ever in it, by Qui-Gon Jinn about the Force and the light, and it's just superb. So that's my number one book. Literally the only complaint I have, and I love the cover too, so the only complaint I have is I thought the title could have been better, but as a title, it actually perfectly encapsulates what's so good about this book is the Master and Apprentice dynamic. So I love this book, love everything about it, best canon novel, and if you put it against Legends, it stacks up against most of the top Legends novels. I'm not saying it's the best, because it's not the best. The best Star Wars novel ever is Kenobi for me, is now and forever will be, but this novel gets pretty close. Pretty high up there. So those are my rankings of the Star Wars canon novels from the adult line from Del Rey. Whew! There's a lot of them. 40 books, 5 categories. Whew! I'm tired. I had to do this video in 2 segments because I was just wiped out after the first one. So, if you've stuck around this long, first of all, thank you. Second of all, I'm very impressed. Third of all, let me know what your comments are down below. And please like and subscribe to the channel. And until next time, I'm Jonathan. And thank you for watching.